Thank you for coming out again, night 12. And tonight is, we have one of the early pieces and one of the most famous pieces, which is the paraphrase carillon for the Feast of the Assumption. But before we get into the pieces for tonight, I just want we have some guests that are new to us tonight. So I usually begin with a few comments, and then we'll have all three sets, and then afterwards, you can applaud if you wish, and then we have a question and answer time. So that's basically the drill. So but before we begin, yesterday I began discussing basically the fall of the church after the French Revolution and the rise of Salem and Gregorian chant in reaction to a generation of people that had not gone to church, and it was reacting against pop culture entering the church, 19th century pop culture. And so I think we need to move a little bit later into the 19th century. I think Metternich said that every time France sneezes, Europe gets a cold or something like that. Well, France went through so many revolutions. They thought that abolishing the monarchy would solve all their problems, and they didn't realize that they were the problem. So they continually had revolutions over and over again. You could, and not just what we would consider government changes as far as a new administration, actual government changes, where you would have the Directorate, Napoleon, and then the return of the Bourbon monarchy, and then the July monarchy with Louis Philippe, and then in 1848 the revolution that happened that year and the rise of Napoleon III, and when he didn't like the idea of term limits, he became emperor. And then in 1870, there is very confusing how this particular war happened, the Franco-Prussian War. Germany was in the middle of coalescing into a nation state because it originally was part of the Holy Roman Empire, but then that was dissolved during the French Revolution. And so they came up with a very loose confederation of principalities. But as the 19th century evolved, it was coming clear that nation states were going to be the future, and Germany wanted to be one of them. And it sort of contrived a situation that got France angry. And so the Franco-Prussian War happened, and Germany coalesced into a nation through that, and beat the French rather decisively. And this led to the capture of Alsace-Lorraine, and then there were huge indemnities that put France into enormous debt. And as a result of this, the Paris Commune happened, which was basically, it's hard to describe what the Paris Commune was, but the citizens of Paris formed their own government, and it was full of different factions. It's hard to describe. And anyway, during the Commune, the Bishop of Paris was murdered. A lot of the Hotel de Ville, the city hall, was destroyed, and along with the Tuileries, and it was a horrible disaster. And then the French army went in and massacred the communards, and many of them were killed on Montmartre, where now Sacré-Cœur is, and that whole Franco-Prussian War became an obsession for France. They had no clue. They really needed to get around their head how they lost, and they re-established. They were trying to establish French identity. One thing that many people may not realize, the one thing by 1870 and 1871, the one thing that most people in France did not do was speak French. They spoke many, many languages, and not just dialects, actual languages. And part of the coalescence of France was to have everybody speak French. And there were a lot of different things like that. The Bastille Day actually became a holiday, an official holiday during the Third Republic. And the Eiffel Tower was created in commemoration of the centennial of the storming of the Bastille. So it was sort of a bumptious display of French superiority by a country that was really insecure. So that was the undercurrent, but also one of the problems that was going on, we talked about the union of church and state and the concordat. That system was still going on. And so clergy were basically civil servants. And in the middle of all this, there was the Dreyfus affair. And Dreyfus was a military figure that was accused of espionage with the Germans. And in the long run, this was just a setup because he was Jewish, and anti-Semitism was a very big thing in the 19th century, and it hadn't fully formed into what we know in the 20th century, but it was well developed. And France started fighting regarding this. Now, the military was the actual culprit in all this. It was kind of a setup because they had feelings against Jewish people, and this was a symbol of that. But in all this wrangling, in 1905, there was the separation of church and state. But in that, while I say separation, they expelled all the monasteries. So Salem, where Gregorian chant was being taught or studied and developed, was banished, and they went to the Isle of Man off of England. And then buildings were confiscated and used for government purposes and all that. And so this happened in and around 1905. And so this was when Tournemire was in his prime, or early years. So he was around 35. He was in his 30s as this was evolving. So he really, in the long run, when you are challenged, you kind of double down on your belief system. So he really honed in his belief system. And also, he was living in a world that was vehemently against him and the church. So when that happens, you have to articulate yourself a lot more deeply. And this is why, when we had the conversation about Bach and why Bach doesn't interest me at this point, I've outgrown him. he was in a world where his ideas were not really challenged. And it was matter of fact that God existed, and this idea, it was rock solid. And he wasn't taught to challenge that thought, whereas Tournemire lived in a world that challenged it. And that's why a lot of his music is a lot deeper, and his studies were a lot more profound, and he was much more articulate. And so all this was going on as he was developing as a musician. Then World War I happened. And during the early part, the first half or the latter half of the 19th century, the movement called positivism was evolving, and there was a sort of just a very science-based and progressive material progress equals societal progress. And with World War I, all the material and scientific growth that they thought had created a great society just fell apart. And it was the rise of nihilism. But there was also a rapprochement with the church, because the church always says, well, we're prone to sinful behavior or self-destructive behavior, not just self-destructive, but other person destructive behavior. And they actually received, the church was affirmed in a certain way because of World War I. And so after World War I, there was a rapprochement between the church and France, and the monasteries were allowed back in. And so Salem came back to the country, and Tournemire visited Salem, and he was gifted by an organist, Joseph Bonnet, the works of Dom Guéranger called L'Année Liturgique, which is a multi-volume set, like 15-volume set of liturgical writings. And this also coincided with the death of Tournemire's wife in around 1920. So he was left bereft, and his life had changed with World War I. Tournemire, prior to World War I, had written a number of orchestral symphonies, all of which are now on YouTube that you can listen to. They are magnificent. But after World War I, the ability to have great symphonic works, like new ones, music that you've never heard before, really wasn't a thing. The country had hemorrhaged so much money and so many people. So the organ became his symphony orchestra because of being bereft of that. And so Tournemire, by 1927, had developed the plan for L'Orgue Mystique. He tested it out at Salem and then began writing it, and he would later finish it in 1932. That's enough for now, and about the pieces for tonight. So in the big booklet, we are now in the middle of Pentecost, and yesterday we finished the Alleluias. Now we are beginning the transition to the chorales. The transitions, there are two transitions in Pentecost. Both have a movement with a prelude and fugue, and then a Marian feast. And tonight's Marian feast is the Assumption. The paraphrase Caroline for the Assumption is, as the title suggests, a carillon. And you'll hear, as I mentioned before, this parallel fifths that represent the bells ringing, because fifths are in the natural harmonics of bells. Messiaen loved this work. There's a very quiet section where there's sort of a chirping of bells. Messiaen was into ornithology, and so he did a lot of bird song things. And this central section really does sound like bird song. It's really supposed to be chimes, but in the distance, but Messiaen heard it as bird song. He thought this piece is a piece that all organists should learn, so it's a very significant work. The rest of the pieces for tonight pretty much speak for themselves. You will hear again the Tournemire chord, this time in the prelude, in the supplication and fugue. It will be used to transition after the supplication into the fugue, and then there's a final prayer at the end. The supplication and fugue modal really delves into that particular psalm text. So when you hear that piece, definitely read the text and you'll understand why it is so dark. And then our final set is the first of the chorales. César Franck, at the end of his life, wrote the three chorales. And the chorale format was a big idea in Tournemire's mind. He was actually one of the few people to have heard César Franck play the three chorales, because he wrote them in the spring-ish into the summer of 1890. Unfortunately, Franck got hit by an omnibus, so a bus. I don't know if it was mechanical or horse-drawn, I can't remember. Anyway, there was a pole on the side of this omnibus, and he got struck in the chest, and it led to pleurisy, but it took a while for it to kick in. And so Franck, it's not known that he really played the three chorales in concert, but Tournemire actually one day was sitting with Franck, and Franck played the hand part, or the manual parts, and Tournemire played the pedal parts on the piano with him. So it's a very vivid memory, and in his memoirs, of César Franck, Tournemire writes about this and how special the three chorales are. So the center section of Pentecost is a set of 5 chorales, and this one is a very simple theme and variation, and it's very poignant. And actually, for organists new to L'Orgue Mystique, I highly recommend this set as an introductory set to so that you can learn what L'Orgue Mystique is about. It's very doable. And anyway, that said, so we have the 9th Sunday after Pentecost, the Assumption, and then the 10th Sunday after Pentecost. Thank you. Any comments or questions? Yes?
That's not Bach.
No, that is not Bach. Having little discussions with organ folk about this, and why I bring up Bach, because it really is because it became sort of a paradigm paralysis, where it became one mode of thought that sort of wiped out other modes of thought. So I think that challenging that is a very good thing. The other thing that I kind of find, and I find this a lot with musicians that were music was foisted upon them at an early age, like Mozart and like some child prodigies. There's a mechanical quality to it. There's definitely an idiot savant thing, and I find it not quite human. And if you've ever sung Bach, for example, you know that it's not meant to be sung. It's a violin part, and you're like, oh my gosh, where do you want me to breathe? It doesn't always fit under the hands. It represents a contrapuntal ideal, and it's very much like a Sudoku puzzle. And once you learn the rules, you can do it. There was one YouTube video where they did a Bach-style fugue on a theme by Lady Gaga, and it was really convincing, and all they did was follow all of his rules, and it was quite amazing. And so I find that Bach works for a lot of people who have very linear thinking, and it's really good for people who want to make sense of the world that's in pure chaos. It's sort of like why people go into math. And also, I have to admit, I work in organ restoration business, and I find in my business, this constant, the minutia of details and repetition and all this kind of stuff. It kind of gathers a lot of people on the spectrum, which makes the world very difficult to work with a lot of times. And I find, like with math and different things like that, that minutia of detail and the need for rules and that kind of linear thinking really does. And I have a list of musicians in my brain right now that are kind of like really on the spectrum. Now that's only when done in extremis, but anyway, this music is really opaque, and it's hard to get your head around, and it's very much, it deals with infinite ideas, and a lot of gray, and unearthing the story of Tournemire and all the politics. And Tournemire was not a pleasant person, but I like his music, and dealing with that little disconnect. He wasn't a bad person, he just was something else. And then dealing with French politics and the Dreyfus affair. Everybody was at fault with that. And dealing with all those gray areas. When I hear Bach, I don't hear gray. It's pretty clear where he's coming from. And he went to a mathematical place to make sense of the world. And I'm not really into that. Yes, next question.
What got you started on Tournemire?
So I had learned some Tournemire in college. The organist at the church I grew up was really good at improvising in a French style, so I had already had that sound in my ears, or the harmonies in my ears. And then I'm a member of St. Clement's, which does Gregorian chant. So I have all those chants in my ears, or like it's sort of normal. And when I came to, there was a point where I revisited some of the old scores that I had purchased a long time ago, and did a couple of noontime concerts. And then I asked church whether or not they wanted a prelude to an evensong with this music, and they said, no thank you, I know you're working on this project, and we're not interested. And I didn't really realize I was working on a project until he told me. And then, so I sort of followed through with that, and then I met some pretty critical figures in the Tournemire world when I asked more questions. And like Robert Sutherland Lord and Ann Lebunsky, and they're both out in Pittsburgh. And then they really prodded me along. And then Dr. Lord died, and he should have written the book. And so, so I started finishing up what he had done, and it sort of all, happened that way. And so, anyway, that's how that whole thing happened. So yeah, and it is it's very strange music. And Langley, his student, I put this on Facebook some time ago, but it's on YouTube. There's an interview with his student, John Langley, and he said that the problem with Tournemire is that he speaks his own language, and that is very difficult for an artist because it can also mean that people don't understand you. So anyway, so that's part of the Tournemire problem, and he has higher standards than a lot of people like to live up to. So, which made him very unpopular amongst other organists. So, and he was objectively right, I have to say. Any questions? Yes?
Why do you think that the pièce terminale from number 35 is one of the most popular?
I think the paraphrase Caroline from The Assumption is popular? I think there are a couple of things. First of all, it has an easily discernible form. It's ABA. People like that level of clarity. For Catholics, the Salve Regina is pretty clear in the pedal, so that helps. It ends with a major chord, which does help. Although there are big, like 13ths and 9ths and all that kind of stuff, it's still pretty diatonic, even though it's. Then the other thing is that it was one of the first to be. He did like 5 pieces to begin with, and did just principal feast days, and the Assumption was one of them. So it was one of the first to be published, and it was performed by Tournemire on recording. And so there was a lot of lead time before he died, where this piece could get out to the public. So there was, the problem with Organ Mystique was it came out during the Depression, and Hugel, Hugel or whatever, the publisher was starting to run out of money due to the Depression, and so he had to prolong the publication dates. And then it was like 1937 by the time the last one was published, and then of course Europe went to war. And also in 1938, Tournemire developed prostate cancer and had prostate cancer surgery, which I cannot imagine in the 1930s. It did not go well. And he did have some attempts at some recitals after that, but he was pretty exhausted after that point. So he didn't have a lot of time at the end of his life to promote Lord Mystique. And, but the Assumption, on the other hand, had that lead-up time. So he had like a good, like 5 or 7 years before he was not viable as an organist to promote this. And he, like I said, he did a recording of it, and some of his other students actually played it, and Messiaen promoted it as well. So those are the reasons. And well, thank you so much. I'm sorry tonight is a longer one, but the Assumption is a long work. But next week we will do the chorales, and then we end up. I think we end with the second transition, and then following week we may actually begin the chorale Alleluiatiques, which are a hybrid between the chorales and the Alleluias, and then we have the final week, which is Holy Week, which I can't believe we're at Holy Week, but I can believe it because I'm tired right now doing all this stuff. So, yeah, it does seem like a long time. Anyway, thank you very much, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask me at the door. Thank you.